I knew the project was in trouble the day my boss decided to streamline a contract worth $50 million with nothing more than a half-baked idea scribbled on a napkin. I'd been running this specialized project team for years, bringing in high-value deals that kept our company's lights on and our investors smug. This project wasn't just another win. It was the crown jewel, the one we'd been grinding toward for months. I had personally helped negotiate every line of that contract, knew every clause and subclause like I knew my own signature. My team had built trust with the client brick by brick, flying across the country at 5 a.m. to be in their conference room by 9, troubleshooting issues on weekends, and answering calls during family dinners. We weren't just employees. We were the human glue holding together the most valuable agreement in the company's history. And in walks Mr. Newly Promoted, strutting around with that corporate savior complex you only get from being handed a position you didn't earn. He had the kind of confidence only ignorance can fuel, loud in meetings, allergic to details, and obsessed with looking decisive. Every week he'd barge into our project updates with another bold change that ignored the contract's timelines, technical requirements, or basic logic. We warned him, repeatedly. But to him, warnings were just negativity. He wanted quick wins for his performance review, even if it meant bulldozing over the very process that made those wins possible. One day, he decided the client didn't need certain deliverables in the original scope. Problem was, those deliverables were legally binding, and removing them would be like trying to sell a house without the foundation. We told him that. He smiled like we were cute for worrying and pushed ahead anyway. I started to see the cracks forming, not in the project's technical structure, but in the trust we'd spent years building. And in this business, once trust goes, everything else follows. That's when I realized, if you're reading this and not subscribed yet, you're basically my boss ignoring the contract. 97% of people do it. But hitting that subscribe button is the one thing that keeps the team alive. It takes a second, and trust me, it means more to us than you think. By this point, my calendar was nothing but damage control meetings. My team, some of the sharpest people I've ever worked with, were running on fumes. Instead of focusing on solving client issues, they were scrambling to patch the holes his decisive leadership kept tearing open. I'd find myself staying late, alone in the office, staring at the contract and wondering how much longer this could hold before the structure gave way. The irony was, buried deep in that contract, was a clause I had fought to include years ago, a clause nobody but me seemed to remember. It tied the $50M performance bond directly to my continued employment. Back then, I'd insisted on it as a safeguard. I didn't trust the company not to scapegoat us if things got rocky. If I left or was removed, that bond was automatically voided. No bond meant the client could walk without penalty. At the time, it was just insurance for my team's stability. I never thought it would become a loaded gun aimed right at the company's head. Watching my boss operate, I started to feel the weight of that clause like a secret key in my pocket. He was so focused on flexing his authority that he never noticed the ground he was standing on was hollow. Every reckless move brought us closer to the edge, and every smirk he threw across the table made me think, "You really have no idea what's coming, do you?" I didn't say a word about it, not yet. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that in corporate warfare, silence can be the sharpest weapon you've got, and I had no intention of wasting mine too soon. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind that starts off feeling heavy before you even get out of bed. My inbox was already a war zone, the client growing impatient, my team running on caffeine fumes. I walked into the office to find a meeting invite from my boss, marked urgent. No agenda, just conference room 3 now. That's never good news. The whole team was already there when I arrived, faces pale, coffee cups clutched like life preservers. My boss stood at the head of the table, leaning on it like some high school football coach about to yell at the kids for losing the big game. He had that smirk again, the one that says he's been rehearsing the speech in the mirror. "Let's not waste time," he barked, voice just loud enough to make sure everyone walking by could hear. "This project is sinking, and it's because of you." He jabbed his finger toward me like he was swatting a fly. My team's eyes flicked to mine, searching for some kind of signal, but I kept my face neutral. I'd learned long ago that showing emotion in these moments is just giving them ammunition. He launched into a laundry list of grievances: missed milestones, lack of initiative, failure to adapt. All the usual corporate buzzwords people use when they can't admit they're the problem. Not one mention of the reckless scope changes he'd forced through, or the deadlines he'd cut in half without consulting anyone. He was painting us as incompetent, and himself as the reluctant hero forced to take action. Then he leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered the line like it was some mic drop moment: "Be grateful we're not suing you." For a second, I just stared at him. Not because the threat scared me, lawsuits cost money, and the company was already bleeding, but because in that single moment, everything clicked. I felt the shift like a pressure drop before a storm. He thought he was ending my career. What he was really doing was pulling the trigger on the one clause in that $50M contract that could gut the company overnight. I didn't react. Didn't smile, didn't frown, just a slow nod like I was absorbing the weight of his words. Inside, though, it was like flipping a switch. I knew exactly what was coming next, and the best part was he didn't. He dismissed us with a wave, already looking past me to his next urgent meeting. My team was in shock, some whispering to each other, others just staring at the table. A few were on the edge of tears. I wanted to tell them not to worry, that this wasn't the end, but I couldn't, not yet. Because in less than 24 hours, the most expensive lesson of his career was going to crash down on him, and I wouldn't have to lift a single finger to make it happen. The words hung in the air like the smell of burnt coffee, sharp, bitter, impossible to ignore. You're all done here, just like that. Months of work, years of trust, and the backbone of the company's most valuable project were erased with a single arrogant command. No formal review, no warning, no attempt at salvaging the situation. Just corporate execution by ego. I watched my team process it in real time. Sarah, who'd spent more nights in hotel conference rooms than in her own bed to keep this project on track, stared down at her hands, knuckles white around a pen she wasn't even holding straight. Daniel, the guy who could debug in his sleep, blinked hard, jaw clenched like he was holding back a flood. Even Mike, who usually cracked jokes when things got tense, sat frozen, lips pressed together. A couple of them broke completely, quiet tears sliding down cheeks as they realized the floor had just dropped out from under their careers. And me? I sat there perfectly still. Not out of shock. Not entirely, but because I knew opening my mouth right now would ruin everything. There's a kind of power in silence, especially when you're holding the detonator. And in my case, that detonator was a piece of legal dynamite buried so deep in the $50M contract that even the company's legal team probably forgot it existed. That clause. My clause. I'd fought for it years ago in what had been one of the longest, most exhausting contract negotiations of my life. Back then, the idea was simple. The client wanted assurance that the key people responsible for delivering the project wouldn't be shuffled around or cost cut out of existence halfway through. I wanted assurance that my team wouldn't become the scapegoats for upper management's mistakes. The result was a binding performance bond, $50 million, tied directly to my continued employment. Fire me, and the bond didn't just weaken. It collapsed, automatically. The genius of it was that it wasn't open to interpretation. No "we'll review the situation" language. No wiggle room for lawyers to argue intent. My termination would trigger an immediate, automatic revocation of the bond by the issuing provider, which in turn would drop the client's trust rating on the project to zero. And without that trust rating, the contract itself was in breach, instantly. The only people who had ever truly understood the weight of that clause were me, the client's senior legal counsel, and one very sharp bond underwriter who'd once told me over coffee, "You realize you're basically the keystone of a $50M arch, right?" I'd laughed at the time. But now, sitting in that conference room with my boss grinning like a man who thought he'd just scored the winning touchdown, I realized I wasn't the keystone anymore. I was the removal of it. As security was called to escort us out, I looked at each of my team members. I didn't lie and say it would be okay. I didn't give them false hope about rehiring or finding something else in the company. Instead, I told them the truth that mattered. You did good work here. The best. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to as they packed up their desks. I walked out last, my box of office junk in hand, past my boss's office door. Through the glass, I saw him leaning back in his chair, laughing with another exec, probably about how fast he'd cleaned house. I let my eyes linger for just a moment, not long enough for him to notice. If only he knew that in firing us, he hadn't cleaned house. He just ripped out the foundation. And in less than a day, he was going to watch the whole structure come crashing down. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed faintly, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before but now seemed sharper, more deliberate, like the building itself knew something was about to change. Security trailed us at a polite but pointed distance, the kind of presence meant to remind you that your badge doesn't open doors anymore. My team carried boxes filled with the tiny pieces of themselves they'd left in this place, coffee mugs, framed photos, the occasional stress ball. It felt less like leaving a job and more like evacuating a home after a storm warning. We didn't speak much. There wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't turn into bitterness or tears, and both were useless right now. I kept my pace steady, eyes forward, until we passed by the glass-walled corner office. There he was, my boss, leaning back in his leather chair like a king surveying conquered land. Another executive sat across from him, and the sound of their laughter spilled into the hallway. I caught just enough to hear the phrase "cleaning house." That was the moment. Not when he fired us, not when security took our badges, but right there, hearing him gloat while still oblivious to what he'd just set in motion. That's when the quiet satisfaction started to hum in my chest. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd fixed the problem. And in less than 24 hours, he was going to learn that he hadn't fixed anything. He detonated it. I didn't slow down, didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, I kept walking, holding my box like it was just another Tuesday. Inside, though, I was already counting down. The clause was airtight. The moment my termination was logged with HR, the bond provider would be notified. The language in the contract was merciless. Upon cessation of the named party's employment, the performance bond shall be deemed revoked in full. One email from their system to the client's legal team, and the project's trust rating would be obliterated. Breach of contract. No appeals, no grace period. I designed it to be fast on purpose. Years ago, I'd argued that if a company truly lost the person it had guaranteed as essential to delivery, the client shouldn't have to wait months to find out the work was in danger. I had no idea then that one day it would work in my favor, but I knew now it was about to work perfectly. At the elevator, we all paused for that awkward shuffle, people deciding who gets off on which floor, who rides down together. Sarah caught my eye, and for a moment I almost told her. She deserved to know that the man who'd humiliated her in front of the client last month would soon be choking on the taste of his own arrogance. But I didn't. The fewer people who knew, the cleaner this would be. When we hit the lobby, the receptionist gave us a sympathetic smile, the kind you reserve for people leaving a funeral. We signed the last of our paperwork, returned our badges, and stepped out into the cold. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Not because I was free from the job, but because I was holding a secret so sharp it could cut a corporation in half. On the train ride home, I watched the city pass by in gray blurs and thought about how many times I'd defended this company, fought for its deals, worked through weekends to save its reputation. And now my silence was going to be the undoing of the very people who thought they could discard us without consequence. No angry emails, no threats, no need for me to lift a finger. By this time tomorrow, the fallout would begin, and every ring of their office phone would sound a little more like an alarm bell. And the best part? I wouldn't even have to be in the building to hear it. I got home, dropped the box from my desk on the kitchen table, and didn't even bother unpacking it. My apartment felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm but still holds the static in the air. I tossed my jacket on the back of a chair, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down with my phone. There was one thing I needed to do before I let myself enjoy what was about to unfold: verify. I knew the clause. I'd written it, argued for it, defended it through 2 rounds of contract red lines that nearly killed the deal before it started. But I also knew that in the corporate world, even ironclad terms can get twisted if someone's desperate enough. I wasn't going to leave this to chance. I called David first, an old friend who'd been a corporate contracts attorney for 20 years. I gave him the shorthand version: performance bond, tied to my employment, $50M project. I was terminated today. Am I right in thinking that bond is gone? He didn't even pause. Gone the second HR files your termination in the system. And if the bond is gone, the contract's dead. If it's written the way you're saying, there's no way to patch it without you. I called Melissa next. She'd worked for the bond provider at one point and knew their internal processes better than anyone. Her laugh was low and almost wicked. Oh, send the revocation notice before you've even had dinner tonight. Automated trigger. The client will see it in their inbox before your boss finishes patting himself on the back. 2 more calls, 2 more confirmations. By the time I hung up, it was unanimous. The clause wasn't just enforceable, it was a sledgehammer, and it was already mid-swing. I didn't have to sue. I didn't have to send a single threatening email. The system was built to work without me lifting a finger, and that was the beauty of it. My boss had no idea he'd just fired the one person who kept the project, and by extension, the company's reputation, safe. He'd made a move that looked decisive in the short term but was catastrophic in the long term, and the clock was already ticking. Of course, that didn't mean I didn't have enemies. I knew there'd be people inside the company who would try to spin this as unexpected complications or unforeseen circumstances, the kind who think if they talk fast enough, they can convince the client not to walk. But the client wasn't stupid. They'd insisted on that clause for a reason. They wanted someone they could trust to see the project through, and now that person was gone. As for allies, I had them, though most wouldn't even realize they were helping me. Former colleagues still inside who'd be whispering updates, people in the industry who would hear the panic calls and know exactly what it meant. My network wasn't huge, but it was tight, and in situations like this, that's what mattered. I leaned back in my chair, phone still warm in my hand, and let the satisfaction settle in. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic movie sense. I wasn't plotting an elaborate scheme or pulling strings behind the scenes. This was quieter, cleaner, inevitable. Like watching a chess opponent walk into a trap you'd set 12 moves ago. All I had to do now was wait. And if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that the people who underestimate you never see you coming until it's far too late to stop you. The next morning started like any other, at least for me. I was in no rush. The sun was barely cutting through the blinds, the smell of fresh coffee filling my kitchen, and I had the kind of quiet, unhurried energy you only get when you know the day ahead is going to be far more interesting for other people than it will be for you. Halfway through my first cup, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an old teammate who'd managed to survive the purge for now. Something's going down. No punctuation, no explanation, just that. I took a slow sip before replying, define something. Three dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then, client got a call from the bond provider this morning. Revoked is the word flying around. People are freaking out. I smiled into my mug, right on schedule. The thing about a performance bond revocation is that it's not just a piece of paper disappearing. It's a neon sign flashing no confidence over the entire project. To the client, it means risk has gone from manageable to catastrophic overnight. To the company, it means contracts, deadlines, and payment schedules are about to collapse in on themselves. And to the bond provider, well, they'd already washed their hands of it. I imagined the scene playing out in the office. Hushed conversations in hallways, managers leaning into each other's cubicles, people refreshing their email with that anxious, jittery rhythm. Somewhere in there, my boss was probably still calm, maybe even dismissive. It's just a formality. We'll sort it out. He'd be telling himself that because the alternative, that he'd personally caused a breach in the biggest contract in company history, hadn't yet fully sunk in. But it would. Revocation notice wouldn't just go to the client's project manager. It would land directly in the inbox of their senior legal counsel, the same one who had insisted on the clause in the first place. That's where the real panic would begin. I pictured the client's lawyers combing through the contract, landing on the exact language I knew by heart, and realizing there was no patch, no workaround, no delay tactic that could undo it. I checked my phone again. Another text, this one from someone in finance. They're pulling everyone into a conference call at 11. Looks bad. Then a follow-up a few minutes later. Your boss looks like he hasn't slept. Not sure he knows why yet. That was the delicious part, knowing the storm had started but that he was still standing there without an umbrella, too busy congratulating himself on cleaning house to notice the floodwater rising around his ankles. I topped off my coffee, settled into my chair, and stared out the window. I didn't need to be in the building to feel the tension tightening its grip on every floor. The mechanism was in motion, just as designed. And the funny thing about a mechanism like that, once it's triggered, it doesn't stop until it's done. In a couple of hours, the pieces would start falling faster. Calls would be made. Voices would get louder. And somewhere between the first round of damage control and the second, my boss was going to connect the dots and realize that the person he'd tried to humiliate had been holding the company's lifeline the whole time. I wondered how long it would take before someone finally asked him the question that would make his stomach drop. Why did you fire the one person this contract can't function without? By noon, the messages started coming in so fast I had to flip my phone to silent. First from an ex-colleague in IT, all hands in the exec wing. CEO's here. Legal's here. Your boy looks like he's aged 5 years overnight. Then from someone in procurement. Client's legal team is on a call with the CEO and boss's name. You're going to love this. I set my coffee cup down, already picturing it. I knew exactly how that conversation would start because I knew the people on the other end of the line. The client's senior counsel wasn't the type to sugarcoat anything. He had a voice like cold steel and a knack for dropping questions that cut straight through all the corporate posturing. And sure enough, 5 minutes later, I got the text that made me laugh out loud. Their opening line was, "Can you explain the meaning of the word revoked?" Oh, I could explain it. Hell, I could recite the clause from memory, word for word, down to the punctuation. Upon cessation of the named party's employment, performance bond shall be deemed revoked in full, with no reinstatement possible without the written consent of the client. Legal poetry. And now, there it was, being read back to the very man who had unknowingly pulled the pin. I imagined the blood draining from his face in real time. That split second when bravado turns to confusion, then to panic as the implications start stacking up like dominoes. Without the bond, the contract was dead in the water. And because the breach was instant and unconditional, the client could walk away today, take their money with them, and slap the company with a claim for damages while they were at it. From what I heard later, the silence after that question was so thick you could have carved it with a letter opener. My boss tried to spin it, muttering something about transitional challenges and operational restructuring. The client's legal rep didn't even acknowledge it, just repeated the question. Can you explain what revoked means in this context? That's the thing about legal language. It's not open to interpretation when both sides signed off on it years ago. It means exactly what it says, and in this case, it meant the biggest project in the company's history had just gone from flagship to sinking wreck in less than 24 hours. I pictured the CEO turning his gaze slowly toward my boss, that quiet, deadly kind of look reserved for moments when words are useless. The realization would be dawning not just on my boss, but on every executive in that room. They hadn't lost a project, they'd lost the client, the future revenue, and their credibility in one blow. And the beauty of it, I wasn't in the building. I wasn't on the call. I wasn't even logged into the company's systems anymore. This wasn't some elaborate sabotage. It was the natural consequence of arrogance meeting reality. They'd built the entire structure on a keystone they didn't respect, then ripped it out themselves. By the time the call ended, there was no coming back from it. The breach was official, the bond irrevocably void. The client had the freedom to walk, and from the updates trickling in, they were already drafting the exit paperwork. I leaned back on my couch, phone buzzing again with new updates, and thought about how poetic it all was. All that bluster, all those speeches about accountability and decisive leadership, and in the end, the only decisive thing he'd done was sign the death certificate on his own career. And all I had to do was nothing. By the time the sun started going down, the whole thing had gone from a quiet legal hiccup to a five-alarm disaster. My phone lit up with messages from people I hadn't heard from in months, old colleagues, vendors, even a recruiter I'd brushed off last year. Each one with some variation of "Holy hell, have you heard?" The internal memo dropped just after 5 p.m. The client had formally withdrawn from the project. Not paused, not renegotiated, not seeking adjustments. Pulled, out, completely. The $50M contract that had been the company's pride and joy for the last year was now a smoking crater in the books. No payout, no goodwill, and no chance of salvaging it. Then came the second hit. The bond provider, having seen exactly how this played out, issued a notice to their network effectively blacklisting the company from being considered for future large-scale performance guarantees. That's like a bank putting you on a do not lend list, not because you missed a payment, but because they no longer believe you're capable of telling the truth. For a company built on big-ticket contracts, it was a death sentence with a polite letterhead. And then the ripple effect started. Investors caught wind of the breach in the blacklist, and within hours, the stock price took a nosedive. Calls were being made, emergency meetings scheduled. From what I heard, my boss couldn't even walk down the hallway without people stopping mid-conversation and just staring. His name was already being whispered in tones that weren't just critical, they were lethal. I didn't send a single message, didn't forward the memo, didn't so much as like a post about it. There's a kind of power in letting your absence speak for you, and I knew that right now, my silence was doing more damage than any gloating could. If I said anything, it would cheapen the inevitability of it all. So I sat at my kitchen table, poured myself a drink, and let the evening news trickle in. Apparently, the CEO had spent the day locked in back-to-back calls trying to do damage control, but the client's legal position was unshakable. The breach was clean, the damages justified, and the blacklist irreversible. In one day, the company had gone from courting headlines about record growth to scrambling to plug a hole in the hull before the entire ship went under. And my boss? Well, his name was now a permanent fixture on the disaster. It didn't matter if he stayed or was fired tomorrow, this stain wasn't coming out. Years from now, someone Googling his name would find it in articles about catastrophic project collapses and leadership failures. It would follow him into every interview, every deal, every handshake. I leaned back, glass in hand, and let myself enjoy it, not the destruction itself, but the precision of it. This wasn't chaos. It was the inevitable result of arrogance, negligence, and the inability to listen to the people who actually know what they're doing. No need for revenge speeches. No need for a victory lap. The damage was complete, and all I had to do was sit in my apartment, the city lights reflecting off my window, and let the silence do its work. 2 days later, the dust hadn't settled. It had thickened into a choking cloud. I'd stopped counting the messages from people inside the company. Some were furious, some were scared. A few were quietly amused, though none dared say it out loud. That morning, while I was making breakfast, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize but knew instantly. The CEO's office. I let it ring twice before hitting silence. A minute later, voicemail. I didn't need to hear the whole thing to guess the script, but curiosity won. I played it on speaker, leaning against the counter with my coffee. The assistant's voice was brisk, rehearsed, but the edges were frayed. "Hi, we'd like to discuss bringing you back in to lead the project with your team reinstated, of course. We believe we can find a path forward and repair the relationship with the client. The CEO would like to make a formal offer." I almost laughed. Repair the relationship? That ship hadn't just sailed, it was at the bottom of the ocean, the wreckage already claimed by the fish. The client was gone, the bond was dead, and the blacklist had shut the door on any future deals of that scale. The project was a corpse, and they were asking me to bring it back to life like I was some kind of corporate necromancer. I didn't call back. What would I say? Sure, I'll come rebuild the thing you gleefully burned to the ground just for old time's sake? No, they hadn't just lost the client. They'd lost the one thing you can't buy back in this business, trust, and they'd lost it in the most public, preventable way possible. The irony was almost too perfect. The very clause that had gutted them, the one that pulled the bond out from under their feet, had been sitting in that contract for years. In plain sight, signed by their own executives. I'd even explained it during the original negotiation, spelled it out for anyone who cared enough to listen. But arrogance has a way of making people deaf. They thought firing me would be a clean break, that I'd go quietly, that the project would chug along without a hiccup, and that they'd have a shiny new victory to parade around the next board meeting. Instead, they got a $50 million crater, a client who would never return their calls, and a permanent reminder in the industry that leadership without competence is just self-sabotage with a corner office. I finished my coffee, deleted the voicemail, and went about my day. No speeches, no social media posts, No whispered "I told you so." My revenge didn't need an audience. It was already complete the moment they realized that the bomb had been wired into the foundation all along. And they were the ones who pressed the detonator. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit him.